Welcome to episode 5 of Blooming Topics, an initiative by the Bloom Group Community Services Society to raise awareness and stimulate conversation about pressing societal issues. My name is Cindy Graves. I am the Director of Development and Communications at the Bloom Group and your host for today's podcast. In celebration of International Women's Day, we've produced a series of episodes for the month of March, inviting women within our community from all walks of life to share their experiences, stories, and hope for a gender-equal world. Today we welcome Vanessa Mountain, board member at the Bloom Group and Chief Financial Officer at For Our Future. In this episode, Vanessa reflects on surviving the Sixties Scoop and her journey to having a successful career while remaining committed to her community.
Really glad that you can join us today, Vanessa, and be here with us to talk about your experience with what it means to be an Indigenous woman in Canada, and what breaking the bias means to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's an interesting topic. Breaking the bias, I think, for me would be where there isn't this gender differentiation all the time. When it comes to corporate world, I guess, is what I'm looking at. Being able to be seen at your job at the same level as that at the job or somebody else. As for me, for Indigenous, someone else that's not Indigenous but working in the same role, there tends to be this unconscious bias where a lot of people have this built-in stereotype. And they don't think they do, but when you're on the other end, you tend to see it, feel it, sometimes hear it when they don't realize that's what. So it's not just gender equality, it's just individual equality, if that makes sense.
And so how is that showing up for you, this maybe unconscious bias that you're talking about? Maybe not aware of it, but you've certainly experienced it. What does that look like?
It's very subtle. Like sometimes people will speak to me about a certain topic or something, and they'll come up with something like "you people," and it's like, what do you mean, you people? And just say we're First Nations, we're Indigenous. Don't go like you people. Another type of thing is the unconscious bias of thinking Indigenous people are, not as adept at working in a corporate situation or not, or any job. I think there's a lot of.
Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I would have to say I have. My last role, it was in a role where Indigenous was in the title, and it was interesting to see that I would be called upon if it was something that had to do with culture or community, this community, that community, that community, but not really utilizing my skill set, not realizing that the first half of my career was in the finance industry, working my way up through a major financial institution, from a teller up to assistant branch manager. That not being taken into account, taking into account that I was a CGA, that was never looked at, just that kind of stuff. Being a manager of a small loan organization for Indigenous people, that kind of stuff, and just not really looking at that piece of my career.
Vanessa, could you maybe speak a bit more to your experience, what you encountered as an Indigenous woman in leadership position, in terms of biases, prejudices that you encountered along the way?
It's still that same sort of not being recognized as somebody who could figure out a problem, help solve a problem, have ideas. I did encounter a lot of times I would put forward ideas, and it was basically brushed aside. And realizing later that after all the conversations, that idea was, hey, that's not so bad. But just the initial, not even taking it into consideration, which was really hard. It got to the point where I wasn't even worried about putting an idea forward because what's the point? Just get shot down.
So it must be hard when you have ideas put forward and no one's listening.
Yes, it's very hard. Yeah. I think it's also has to do with being female and being in a corporate situation. And there's the old boys' school club sitting around the table with you. It's that same idea. It's a woman. The ideas can be more emotional than practical.
Now, how does being an Indigenous woman shape your experience being a mother?
I actually grew up in a non-Indigenous family, but I do see a lot of my relatives that do struggle with the idea of nurturing, the idea of taking care of kids due to the past generational traumas and everything in there. So it can be a struggle for a lot of Indigenous women. And I don't really think I can talk to that properly, as I didn't have that particular experience. I had a different type of trauma, and it was waiting before being in the non-Indigenous family, was being taken away from my mother. Even though
Can you talk about that a bit more?
Sure. That was part of the Sixties Scoop, which was another government initiative. Oh, I won't call it initiative. It's a government way of trying to assimilate Indigenous people. You know, you have this young Indigenous woman, pregnant, not married. She goes to have the child, and she's told that the child either died in childbirth or she's tricked into signing adoption papers when she's thinking she's signing foster care papers, which was the case for my mother. So I was taken away from her like, practically within days of being born. So it was that initial separation and the inability to form that bond, even with my own children. There's still that bond that really hasn't happened. So I never got to form a bond with my mother. So that might be more of where I could say being Indigenous. I did have my difficulties. It's a little bit different. It's really hard to explain, but there's a little bit of difference there when there's a bond, like that physiological bond. So mine was broken right away.
Was there a sense of abandonment when you realized that you'd been
A
removed from your
subconsciousness, yeah, I think it was very subconscious. It was more physical reactions to certain things that I would react to that some people might have thought was not how you react. You know, a real silly one that happens. It's really, I'm embarrassed to say it, but if my husband and I
nobody's watching.
yeah, right. If my husband and I are driving, and if I'm driving and he falls asleep, just because it's a long trip, people fall asleep. Yeah, we're not driving. Yeah, I get upset. I feel like, why are you sleeping? Why aren't you talking to me? Don't leave me. Wake up, right? So,
You're not being heard. You're not being ignored.
yeah, exactly.
And then, how old were you when you met your mother?
33. I had 2 full-blood brothers, a full-blood sister, and a half-sister. So they all knew about me right from the get-go. And
Nobody had reached out.
they tried, but the way everything was back then, I could give you the year.
Yeah. 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yes. The records were all sealed. So as much as they tried, no information was given to them.
What was that like, meeting your parents for the first
It
time?
was a little bit surreal because you could see in my sister, you could see me. You can see me and my dad. I look more like my dad than my mom.
Well, how does that experience being a 60 Scoop survivor shape your experience being a daughter?
It was one of those situations. Mom was really sick. My biological mom. We had some time alone, and I had told her before, but she just wouldn't believe me. I told her, "Oh, I forgive you." And she's like, "Oh, no, how can you? I messed up." Blah blah blah. It's like, no, you didn't do what you had to do. Whatever happened happened. It wasn't your fault. You had no control over that situation, so how can you feel? You'd have no reason to feel guilty, and I have no resentment or anything towards you. Never did. I will. So I hope that she took that to heart. She passed about 3 days later. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. You got a chance to talk to her about that.
Yeah. I did definitely have a bout or have a wrestling match with depression and anxiety for a few years. Just everything started coming out. It was just like, who am I now? 'Cause to these people, I'm this person, and to these people, I'm that person, and I have kids, and then I'm that person. So who am I? I guess I have to start again. This whole other side of my existence has come up. So it's been a little bit of a rocky road here and there, but we're coming up the other side. It's been better. It's become better than it was.
Now, when you were growing up with the white family, raised you, did they encourage you to, culturally to get to know your Indigenous culture, or how did you?
They didn't know where I came.
They didn't know.
I didn't grow up on the reserve. I don't know a lot of my own traditions and culture. I'm closer to the Coast Salish traditions and cultures. I was working with the Squamish Nation for a few years, and then married into the Kwakwaka'wakw region up on the north end of Vancouver Island. So I know a lot more of their culture and traditions and songs and dances than I do my own. I'm learning more, definitely learning.
That was empowering. It was a pleasure featuring you on this podcast episode, Vanessa. Thank you so much. Vanessa's story is remarkable, and we're grateful she shared it with us. I believe our listeners and viewers will be moved and empowered by her story. On this note, we've come to the end of our series celebrating International Women's Day. It was an incredible month hearing from all of our guests. Thank you to all the superstar women who shared their stories and unique experiences and hopes to uplift other women. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast, YouTube channel, and follow us on all our social media platforms for more episodes discussing important topics that impact our community. See you next time.